Welcome to Redefining Engagement. I'm Francesca Duma, Director of Audience Development and Strategy at Contribly. And in this show, I speak to leaders and innovators in the media industry so that we can bring tips, wisdom, ideas, and even some things to avoid so that we can all do more engagement better. So without further ado, let's move on to our next guest. Hi, Markus. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk a little bit about engagement. As you already know, I work at Contribly. We work with news publishers, local, hyperlocal, B2B, looking at what that engagement means. We tend to work with brands that are frustrated because, most of their engagement might be happening on social, or they're struggling to convert readers into subscribers, maybe are looking at high levels of churn, or also are maybe unsure about how to build relevance and trust in their brand. And on my side, we solve this by looking at community engagement specifically. And as part of what we're trying to do, and as I've shared with you before, we're exploring the definition of what engagement means, because in our industry, so many brands see it completely differently. And also so many people and individuals within the teams also define engagement in a very different way. So we're trying to define what engagement means. And part of that is to explore what everybody else believes it is for them. And we've spoken before. You've got amazing experience around it. You're data-driven as well. And I'm really excited to hear more about that. Would you be up for just sharing who you are, where you work, just to start off with?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm the director of news in Amedia in Norway, which is basically a publisher that owns about 109 local newspapers. By the last time of counting, our CEO tends to buy one or two from time to time. So we spread all over the country of Norway, which is a long country. So we're quite decentralized in terms of newsrooms, but every supporting function we have are located in Oslo, the capital of Norway, where I work as well. So I've been the director of news for about a year. My experience before that was as an editor in 2 local newspapers in northern Norway and as a journalist. So that's my background. And in terms of the area I'm in charge of at the media, that it's basically 2 things. It's editorial development and it's editorial product development. And to put it in a tabloid way, the first part of that is basically interactions with humans, and the second part is interactions with technology and product development.
And your experience is so relevant to this piece, because I think on one side, engagement is definitely about people. And on the other side, it is about the products that you use to do engagement. So you're the perfect person to be talking about this, I think. My first question to you is, what does audience engagement mean to you?
I think in its core, I would say audience engagement for me means how much value do people extract out of the products they use or engage with. So if I were to construct the perfect measure of audience engagement, that would be it. Obviously, that's really difficult to measure. So our approach is basically how close to that can we get in a way that's also easy to understand on every level in our company, from CEO level all the way down to each journalist that goes to work every day to provide stories for the local communities.
So would you say the definition should be the same from CEO all the way down to your local journalist in your experience?
Yeah, ideally it should be, but obviously the metrics you look at probably shouldn't be the same. So our philosophy is simplifying the metrics and sort of distillating them into something that's basically the core of what drives engagement and use, and thereby also drives the experience from the user's perspective.
And your experience is so vast, because you're obviously in this role, but you have worked throughout media. Would you say your definition has changed? Your definition of audience engagement has evolved in the past few years?
Yeah, definitely. And I need to explain my background as a journalist, because when I started working as a journalist, I started in a print-only monthly magazine uh, which didn't have really. It had a website, but it wasn't updated, so it wasn't like an online part of the operation at all. And we started an online newspaper, as late as 2013, actually. At first, that was a free site model, and basically our way of measuring engagement or the use of our products was how many page views and how many unique users do Google Analytics tell us that we have. So we were pretty much blind in terms of engagement and metrics at that point. Um, and when you measure these kind of short term, or if when you measure engagement that short term, you're kind of driven to do different choices and produce different journalism, which was very clear the moment we decided to put our content behind the paywall. And basically, overnight, the way we thought about producing content changed, because the metrics we were driven by changed from flat page views to how many subscribers can we attract, which, in my humble opinion, provided a better platform to make journalistic choices, because the journalism that's valuable enough for me to subscribe to is a different kind of journalism to the free journalism I'm inclined to perhaps have a peek at now and again. So that was a really interesting experience to be a part of.
And I guess you've mentioned measuring, but before mentioning measuring, what would you say the aims of audience engagement within the strategy is? Like, what are they delivering on? What's the end goal, in your opinion?
The end goal is to ensure that you provide value for your customers, I would say. That should be the starting point, basically. If not, I can't really see the point in measuring audience engagement if that's not your goal. So obviously, value can be several things, and it depends on a lot of factors like your business models or your content or your profile. But again, at its core, I think it's the value how close can you get to measure the actual value you provide for your customers is basically I think the main gist of it.
Yeah, and it's, in a sense, I'm guessing you're saying it's relevance in
Yeah,
some kind of way.
yeah,
That's hard to
absolutely.
measure.
Absolutely, and certainly in terms of news providers, I would say relevance is a really really precise word to describe what you're trying to achieve.
And measuring that, like, what do you do at the moment to measure relevance?
Yeah, so we measure a lot of things, and we got a lot of data, and a lot of really well structured data. But what we measure and what we capture in terms of data is an entirely different thing to what we're looking at when we're evaluating performance, so to speak. So in our newsrooms, basically, we measure. We have a couple of key metrics. One of them is what you could call top stories, which are basically stories that reach a minimum threshold in terms of readership amongst our subscribers. That's the way we've chosen to do that kind of metric. Obviously, because we are really subscription driven, and about 70% of our economy is based on subscriptions. So
Huge.
that's obviously why we've chosen that approach. And also, we measure and follow really closely how much use do our subscribers get out of their subscription, both in terms of daily usage, which is the main KPI, but also a bit more sophisticated than that. For instance, we have a podcast platform where weekly usage is more relevant than daily usage, and so forth. But basically, it's usage we're trying to measure. We also try to enrich those usage numbers with, like, for instance, not average reading time, but reader scores or reader metrics, which try to explain: have you really read this article, or have you scrolled past it or through it? So we try to enrich our data and our KPIs with metrics that tells us or gets us a bit closer to really evaluate if you experience value out of what you consume, because consumption and engagement, or consumption and satisfaction, isn't the same thing necessarily. But at its core, it's those two things that we really focus on.
So it's you are publishing outwards and you are trying to measure how much people are actually consuming inwards in a sense.
Yeah,
And
and yeah,
yeah.
and the reason for that is how closely linked that is with our churn numbers. So when we get users to return to our products, often they don't churn, and it's pretty much as simple as that. So that's a kind of that's our method of measuring what you would call relevance.
So massive focus on habit building with your readers in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
And obviously engagement isn't easy. It's not something that just comes to everyone. You have to work on it. What would you say are the biggest hurdles in your experience? What's stopping brands from engaging better?
I think one of the things that's been really difficult for the news industry, at least, is to sort of split focus between the print operations and the digital operations, because you don't really have a sense of, or you can't measure precisely the engagement in the print product, but suddenly you can measure it quite precisely in terms of digital products. And at least in our case, it turned out that the content we produced didn't really feel relevant in the digital world. So that's been a big hurdle for us, trying to sort of shift the culture in the way that the most important thing is building digital engagement, and not focusing on what was at the time the main contributor to our economy, which was print. Now it's turned around. Now we've got the 60-40 split in terms of digital revenue.
And how are
So
you doing that?
yeah, by working really hard for 10 years on trying to sort of we've not ignored the print product, but it's been a byproduct of what we do digitally, and we've shifted the entire focus um, from producing things for print to producing things digitally. It sounds quite easy, but in terms of getting a newsroom to, first of all, be with that notion. Second of all, to actually follow through with it. It's quite hard, and we've we've kept at it for years, and we've worked with a number of quite primitive measures, really. So, for instance, our CEO, who's an old editor in one of our biggest newspapers, he actually blocked the access to the print operations desk, where they sort of, where they put together the printed version of the newspaper. He refused the journalists to go in there, so he put his desk in front of that and basically stopped them physically, just to ensure that they didn't run to the print desk and wanted to change a headline or wanted to do some last kind of editing specifically for print. So there's been a combination of those kind of methods, which is quite primitive and not really advanced, but also the method of measuring what you do really concisely and precisely, and acting on what you find. And for us, I think the main part of why we've managed to shift is that we could prove that it worked. So when we started doing this, we had effect, and we could measure it precisely. And I think that's another main hurdle that many stumble upon. They can't really show the effect of the cultural shift they're trying to achieve, which then makes it really difficult to sort of enforce that message. And I think that's the main barrier for a lot of brands.
I absolutely love that example of like literal physical change in the buildings that you're in, as well as proving that the change that you're trying to make is working. It makes so much sense. What would you say has proven the most effective way of engaging audiences so far?
It's the simple notion that we managed to establish a company-wide goal that extends all the way down to the journalists, in terms of what are you trying to achieve when you go to work? you don't really have to tell a journalist why they go to work, right? They've got quite strong ideals, and they've got quite strong ideas about why they do what they do. So you don't really need to sort of work on that side of the motivation. What we've worked on is okay. Your motivation as a journalist is to write important stories. I get that. Are they important if they don't reach people? I don't think journalism that people doesn't read is important. So we've shifted the objective from producing important journalism to producing important journalism and get people to actually consume it, which is different than the first objective. And by doing that, we've sort of made every journalist responsible as well for that part of the journalistic process, the editorial process. They can't really just, fling a story or a copy to the editor and say, "Go ahead, try to work with this." So every day, our journalists get a report in their inbox where they're with sort of the metrics and the scores for the stories they've done, so they can follow really closely how their content has performed, not just in the paper they're a part of, but even in other papers where that story has been published as well.
That
So for journalists, it's quite easy to understand what are your objective when you go to work. Well, I need to reach this threshold with the stories I produce, and if I don't reach those threshold, I need to perhaps have a rethink about which sources do you interview, what's your angle, what's your approach to the story, and that has a really wide effect on a newsroom when you get people to start think that way about the journalistic mission, so to speak.
that's that one goal, the single-mindedness. I find really impressive, because I think everyone does measure different things, and they are looking at different things, and the clarity helps teams definitely come together. I guess the question around that is, at what point in the process, if you have this really one clear goal that you're going for, at what point in the process of creating the news, or within the newsroom, are you considering the audience engagement piece? How does that take shape up from a day-to-day point? What are the questions that people are asking themselves?
Yeah, this is the part where the editorial development team, which we have had in work since 2016, has played a really vital role. So basically, our ED team is like an internal team of consultants that's traveling around the whole of Norway. They spend 2 or 3 days a week on the road, visiting newsrooms, putting up workshops, sparring with editors, everything you could imagine. Basically, like a consultant group, but internally. These people are former editors or journalists that are really motivated to develop the journalism in itself, right? So, what we've sort of tried to achieve is to make every newsroom responsible for putting audience engagement not just at a point in the journalistic process, but at the start, through it, and at the end. So, the ideal journalistic process in a lot of our newsrooms is actually that's almost the first conversation you have with your editor when you're pitching a story. So, I want to write about this. Okay, but how are you going to make that engaging? How are you going to get people to actually want to read this? Is this the right angle to achieve that? Do we think this can reach a younger audience if that's your goal? What might we change even before we start researching or doing interviews to ensure that we think this is going to hit the mark, so to speak? And the nice thing about this is, because since we have so much historical data, our news editors and our front editors are really good at identifying what a certain story needs in terms of other sources or other perspectives to sort of engage with the audience. So they know their audience really, really well, and that's, I think, is because we have precise and democratized data, which we've not only told them about, but we have sort of integrated that into their news flow as well, or their workflow as well.
It's It's a super user-centric model that you're talking about, where they are the forefront of everything. Have you got any like examples of, a time where that's been really successful, or one that you can remember where maybe even surprised you because it was slightly different to what you were expecting the outcome to be?
Yeah, I suppose the single most effective change we made in terms of metrics and using metrics in a newsroom was when we established the top stories KPI, because what we basically wanted to achieve was what is a KPI that every journalist can understand easily and sort of work towards in their daily work, that also creates the effect that we want, which is that people use our products as often as possible. So what we found was that the number of top stories in a given title correlate really, really close to daily usage numbers, which in turn drives the subscriptions numbers. So if you put those three graphs on top of each other in our titles the last 7 or 8 years, they would almost look like the exact same graph. So the more top or broad stories you produce each day, the more user engagement you get each day, then the users return, and of course that way you build digital subscriptions. And when you can prove that correlation, it becomes a really easy thing to sell to your editors, at least, and it gives them the tools to sort of work with that in their newsrooms. So that's I think the most noticeable single change we did was finding that KPI and sort of using that everywhere. We've done that since 2019, and to this day, it's still our most central KPI in newsrooms.
You sound extremely advanced when it comes to that data side. Have you ever had a moment where something has surprised you in terms of engagement? Like maybe one of those top stories was something you weren't expecting, but now that you're measuring it, it looks different.
Well, we have tried. We obviously try to evolve and develop our metrics all the time to fit better with what we're trying to achieve. For instance, now we're trying to find the right metrics to drive video engagement, which turns out to be quite a different thing to text-based articles. But I would say we did try to do what I know a lot of other actors have implemented, which was a more advanced KPI to measure not just usage, but also kind of satisfaction level or engagement level. So we did try to do like an engagement score, which was was combined of several things and put into an easy score we thought to follow for the journalists and the front editors and the editors. But what actually happened was suddenly we broke the link to the journalists, because they didn't understand how their work could influence that metric. In terms of broad stories, that really is easy to understand. If I write 1 or 2 each day, we have 1 or 2 more broad stories every day. Quite easy to understand. But when we put together the engagement score, our journalists suddenly didn't really understand how their stories, how their work influenced the KPI. So we broke that link, and what really happened was, in terms, what happened was the production dropped in every newsroom. So every journalist, instead of trying to write or provide them a mixed buffet, so to speak, to their readers, and as broad a perspective as possible, with as many different stories as possible, the journalists started to write stories that were meant to keep hold of the readers as long as possible on an individual level. So we produced much longer articles and a lot less articles, which in turn then dropped our readership numbers and our engagement on an overall level for each title. So that really surprised us, because the metric itself was quite precise. It measured exactly what we wanted it to measure, but it influenced the way journalists worked in a way we didn't anticipate. And so we had to backtrack on that, which was quite painful for a lot of people in my team, which had worked closely with it, obviously. So
I can imagine you've basically got chefs and you've gone from being the wok where you're making all of the foods to becoming like a French restaurant and just making
Yeah.
the good food. And you probably have a lot less wastage at the end of it as well. If you wanted to put it in restaurant terms.
Yeah, kind of. But also we started to. So another thing we're really good at measuring is the total production, and also compare that to the number of stories which reach those thresholds. So we talk a lot about, do we write stories that go over or below the threshold, and our percentage of stories below the threshold also exponentially increased when we did this thing, because well, if you write one story a week, then it probably needs to be pretty good to get the same level of engagement from the same number of people as if you write 5 or 6 or 7 stories a week. And if you miss on that one story a week, then your week is basically gone. So it's, yeah, we didn't anticipate that kind of effect. We wanted to sort of inspire the newsrooms to try to be a bit more ambitious with their journalism, and it backfired basically.
That's a really interesting kind of analogy of the way of seeing it, and it's not enough brands are potentially looking at it the way that you do. I guess your role is also product, and obviously the technology that you use to convey those messages to your journalists is very important. What do you see as, like, what kind of like technology, or, you know, do you see a role in AI in this engagement piece that you're using? Is it mainly data focused? What's the, on the product side, what does that look like?
Yeah, so the product side for us is divided into two kinds of products, basically. The products that engage with our newsrooms and our employees, and the products that engage with the users. And if you're asking about the first of those parts, then obviously we want to democratize our data, but we want to be really particular about what kind of data we show to our journalists where, or what kind of that data we think are the important parts of this data. We want to show them insights, not numbers, basically. So we've got what we call the Pulse dashboard, which have all these central KPIs, and is kind of a way to showcase. It's kind of a daily report that's running all the time. So that's on a news title level. But then you also you got individual reports for each journalist, which centers around their content, with not too many, but quite concise metrics like click-through rate and reader scores and those kind of things. And our sort of our North Star, our guiding lights here is to try and make it as accessible and as easy as possible for a journalist to understand, and also to build it into their workflow. So that's the kind of two principles we use for that.
And in terms of, like, obviously this is direct audience feedback in a sense, the data you're getting, how many clicks you're getting. How do you deal with negative audience feedback when it's coming back and it's not working? Culturally, that must be quite difficult. How do you approach that to make your journalists feel like they can get to that next step?
And that's a really interesting thing. One of the things we've experimented quite a lot is what should the threshold for a broad story be? You could obviously put that threshold quite high, and the journalist wouldn't achieve it as often, and you wouldn't get. I don't think that would work really well. So we experiment quite a lot with that, so that it's an achievable threshold. So about 10% of the subscribers in a given title is the threshold level, approximately, for most of our titles. So that's one way we've experimented. Another way we experiment, or another way we try to deal with it, is actually provide analysis about why doesn't it work. So in 2016, when we established the ED team, one of the first interesting findings was that stories about local culture were really low in terms of readership. And well, a simple conclusion to that would be to write less of it, which isn't really what you want from a local newspaper. So instead of that, we try to delve into the stories that we did produce, and find the kind of stories within that field that actually were well read, and try to identify what's the main part, what is the main ingredients that sort of um, describes the stories that do really well. And so we've done a lot of that kind of analysis, and also on a newspaper by newspaper level. It's quite a typical request from our newspapers. Can you have a look at our sports content? It doesn't really perform well. What can we do with it? And the nice thing is we've got 109 other newsrooms which obviously experiment a lot and try to solve all these problems. So there's probably 2 or 3 or 4 that have met these problems before, which they then can talk to. And all of this drives sort of this sharing culture between our newsrooms, which I think is one of the key parts of what I think is the most fun to work in our company, because we're obviously, a lot of our newsrooms are competitors, but not directly in terms of their geographical location. So there's not really there's not really that kind of rivalry going on. It's more what can we learn from each other, and if someone has done anything clever, and for instance now we're focusing on video, then if one news title breaks the or sort of solves the code and starts to perform well, then every other wants to beat them. So it's sort of a healthy competition in that sense. So I think those are the key things we do when we're not succeeding. We try to look at it a bit deeper and find out, well, perhaps we were doing it wrong then if it's not working, and what should we be doing on a quite granulated way as well.
It sounds like very healthy competition, and if anything, your team feel like they're a bit of the coach in the middle that can go and give the advice or point people in the right direction. And that sounds extremely powerful. And then, but what about, so if you had to measure the importance of engagement in your world as you see it at the moment, 1 being the lowest of, importance, 10 being the highest, where would you rate engagement in the overall picture of what you do?
In a philosophical sense, I would say it's existential. It's if we don't engage with our audience, we're going to die. It's that simple. And Norway is one of the few countries that have really succeeded in shifting to a digital first strategy in the local news market. There's a really strong culture for supporting your local news titles in Norway, but you don't really see the same kind of engagement from the younger generation growing up as well now. So I think if we don't succeed in engaging audiences and engaging new audiences at that as well, then obviously we're going to die, because our philosophy is centered around the local newspaper being sort of the glue that keeps a society together. If you don't engage your customers and your audience, you're going to lose that function. And if you lose that function, I think you're losing your right to existence, so to speak.
The young people in the audiences is always something that comes up. What would you define as young people? Because there's so many definitions of that for newsrooms. Yeah.
So I'm glad to report that I'm certainly in the young age group in terms of how we measure it. So it's for us it's under 40, which is young. So basically it's the main audience we're trying to work directly towards at the moment is kind of people that just had kids and settled down a place and are starting to engage with their local communities. Those are the kinds of people we obviously are focusing on in terms of converting or having as subscribers and customers. But we have growing concerns about the position of the newspaper. Not just in terms of an economical sense, but when I grew up, for instance, the newspaper was a part of my of going home and finding it on the kitchen bench. I had sort of a relation to it, even though I probably didn't read much. I'm not so sure that relation in the digital world is going to keep us strong if we do nothing. So we try to experiment quite a lot with that. Um, and personally, I think one of the things that we are going to venture into, and that's going to be key, is I think we need to accept that we probably need to give away a lot more of our content to the younger generations than we have been doing before. So we're currently now exploring the possibility of giving access to younger audiences for a very cheap sum of money, or not no money at all in some instances, at really young ages. So that's something we're exploring, which I think is a step towards this. It's not going to be enough in itself, because we're not really a natural destination for the growing generation, as we have been before. So I think we need also to provide a reason for the coming generations to actually to start to forge that relation with us. And there's some light in this tunnel. For instance, I think a role we could play in the digital world of today is providing sort of a safe place to engage with other people in a community. That role is never going to be taken by TikTok or Facebook or other kinds of platforms. They're not going to do that. So perhaps there's a space where we could sort of create a more pleasant place to spend your time as a young as a young reader of content or young consumer of content.
I am so on the same page with you with that. I think our audience don't necessarily see the difference between social media and the news, whereas we can see a massive difference. So it's aligning our product for them to understand that it is something different. And that safe space is definitely, I'm in agreement with that. And I'm also very happy to say that I count as one of your young ones. So that's fantastic. Yeah. And you kind of have responded to my question in terms of, where do you see audience engagement heading in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you want to add anything to what you've just said in that sense?
Yeah, I think a main challenge for everyone who's going to consume content in the next decade is going to be to understand what's real content and what's not, in terms of the opportunities opening up now with artificial intelligence and the challenges that come with that. I think a really important position for us as a news business to take is to be the guardians of truth, and I think that's going to. I think a smart thing to do would be to shift focus from competing in terms of amount of content, and shift that focus more towards competing in terms of amount of truthful and verified content, validated content, because I think that is going to be something that the younger audiences as well is going to have a really active relationship or relation to. So I think that's an important position for us to take.
In this new world of AI, a lot of things are going to change, and a lot of it is potentially a branding piece that we need to work on as publishers and as news brands. What about the impact that this increased engagement that you've created, this new data-centric, user-centric model? How has that impacted your organization's bottom line, or even your brand loyalty?
Well, the bottom line is, I could show you a couple of graphs. So when we started this project in 2014, the user engagement project, which we called it, the print products were basically dying, and we cut I think half a billion Norwegian kroner in costs. So quite a substantial amount of money. I think we cut about 500 journalists from our then 60 or so newspapers out of necessity. So So that was also a real trigger to doing something different. At the time, we had no digital subscribers. We had basically print subscribers, we had print revenue, and we had some digital revenue, which we realized were never going to weigh up for the loss of print revenue. Since then, we have gone from 0 digital subscribers to about 750,000 at the time of speaking, which is quite a lot in a country of 5.5 million people. So, and as I said, 60% now of our revenue is digital. In terms of our profits, we have returned profits the last 5 or 6 years of about 12-13%. So we're in a really healthy place. We've got no debts now, which also is nice. And we're owned by a foundation as well, which I had to add is probably an important part of the story, because their purpose is to protect journalism. It's not to earn money for shareholders. So we have been allowed to earn money and then reinvest it into our products and our company. So I would say the main driving factor behind this change is our relation to data and our consciousness about using data. That's the main thing that has really driven this change. Without that, it wouldn't be possible.
So if you were going to give one piece of advice to other hyperlocal news groups or even news brands, if they were going to start on a similar journey to yours, what would you say, like the first thing to do or the first thing to focus on is?
Find a way to get your audience logged into your products. Find an incentive for them to log in and provide you with a direct relation to them, a means of distribution. Because that's what a lot of publishers elsewhere have done. They have relied on third-party distribution. You remember BuzzFeed, which wasn't a pleasant story. We've not seen that many stories that are that extreme, but we've seen similar, even in Norway, which is quite a media-friendly market to operate in. We've seen publishers go all in on third-party distribution and without control, without really knowing your audience. So the first advice I would say is find a way to get to know your audience even better. And as I alluded to earlier in the interview, I don't really think Google Analytics does the trick. You need to be slightly more direct in your relation than that.
I absolutely love that. I can't agree more. Thank you so much for your time, Markus. That was super insightful, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.